matching. It's not going to be two-sided. There are going to be goods to be transferred. And the application I'm going to tell you about is kidney exchange. So let's think a little bit about the difference between two-sidedness and one-sidedness first. In Gale and Shapley's model, there are men and women, or firms and workers, or colleges and students, and you can tell at the outset that people on one side of the market can only be matched to people on the other side of the market. So the two-sidedness is essential to the structure of the market. It's worth thinking about that a little bit because there are a lot of markets that have two sides in the end that aren't two-sided markets. In the market for Microsoft shares, there are buyers and sellers. But whether I'm a buyer or a seller is part of the outcome. At a given price, I might be a buyer, and at another price, I might be a seller. But in the market for the labor market for college professors, there are universities and there are professors, and you can tell which one I am. The wage of college professors could drop so low that I wouldn't want to be a college professor anymore, but it could never drop so low that I would want to be a university, just enter the other side of the market. So we get extra structure in the model by saying that there are two sides. But you can also have one-sided matching problems, and indeed kidney exchange is going to be, and that's where anyone can be matched with anyone else in potential. So Gale and Shapley, already in their 1962 paper, observed that one-sided matching was going to be different than two-sided matching. And they said, consider the roommate problem. The roommate problem, instead of having two sets, men and women, just has one set, people. And your job is to pair them in rooms or in canoes, right? People need to form pairs. And the definition of stability is exactly the same as the definition before. If you put two people into a room and one of them finds the other one just completely unacceptable, that he'd rather go home and not have a room, that's not individually rational. And if there are two people not rooming with each other who would both prefer to room with each other, that's a blocking pair. It makes the matching unstable. But what they observed is, unlike in the two-sided matching problem where we can prove a theorem that says there always exists a stable match, when everyone can match everyone else, there might not be a stable match. So consider this example. There are 4 people who need to be paired into 2 pairs, Mr. 1, 2, 3, and 4. And Mr. 1's preferences are he likes 2 better than 3 better than 4. Mr. 2's preferences are he likes 3 better than 1 better than 4. And Mr. 3's preferences are 1, 2, 4. And Mr. 4's preferences turn out not to matter. You notice that maybe you know someone like this. He's everyone's last choice. There's no way to pair them that's stable. The way to see that is everyone else is someone's first choice. Mr. 1, 2, and 3 are someone's first choice. So if you put them, these 4 people, into 2 rooms, one of them will be roomed with Mr. 4. He's very unhappy because 4 is his last choice. And he's part of a blocking pair because he is somebody's first choice. So he just looks at the guy whose first choice he is and says, why don't we room together? I don't like to room with Mr. 4, and I know you would like to room with me. So here's a simple example that shows that the conclusion that we reached about stable matchings when there are 2 kinds of people no longer follows when there's just 1 kind of people. So the two-sidedness played a role. We used to think it played a much bigger role than it does before Mike Ostrovsky showed us that you could do without sides. But this is not a supply chain model either, right? There are cycles in the possible transactions. So the structure matters. And I want to start, since this is a summer school in theory, I want to start not, as I normally would, telling you a lot about kidneys, which I will do soon enough, but I want to start with the prehistory, with some of the matching theory that turns out to be about kidneys, but we had no idea it was about kidneys when we were talking about it. And that starts with a paper by Lloyd Shapley and Herb Scarf in Volume 1, Number 1 of the Journal of Mathematical Economics. So in the very first issue of the Journal of Mathematical Economics, they wrote a paper that explored a simple, abstract model. And in subsequent years, I did some work on it, not at all dreaming that what I was studying was kidneys. And so they called their model a market of housing. And in their market, there are n agents. Each has an endowment that they called a house of an indivisible, 1 unit of an indivisible good. And the houses are different from each other, so each agent has preferences over all the houses. Now we're going to allow trade among agents, and everyone is identified with their house, so it'll be like the roommate problem, except there are endowments, right? So the thing about the roommate problem is you just get matched to the person. Here, you're not getting matched to the person, you're going to get his house. And maybe he'll get your house. Okay? And what they observed in a constructive proof that they attributed to David Gale, they had a long non-constructive proof, what they observed is that here's an algorithm that has a bunch of good properties, and one of the properties is that it produces an outcome in the core. Now remember, what's the difference between the core and the set of stable matchings? We can define stable matchings in different ways, but in the marriage problem where you had men and women, the essential coalitions were just pairs. A blocking pair is a man and a woman. If there are no blocking pairs, there are no larger coalitions that can disrupt the match. But here, we might have to consider larger coalitions. So let's keep that in mind. And let me tell you the algorithm. Here's how Gale's top trading cycles algorithm works to allocate the houses. They say, I'll say it a little differently than I do here. You could do it simultaneously, or you could do it sequentially. Pick an agent at random. Pick someone in the room and say, point to your favorite house. So they could point to their own house. Maybe their initial endowment is the house they like. I could point to Kara's house. And then you say to Kara, point to your favorite house. She points to Ken's house. Ken points to Scott's house. At some point, there must be a cycle. Someone must point to a house that has already been pointed to. Why is that? There are only a finite number of houses. You can't keep pointing to houses and not get back to one that you've started. So eventually there's a cycle. It might not include me, right? I might point to Ken, and Ken points to Manny, and Manny points back to Ken. Now there's a cycle between Ken and Manny. I started pointing, but I'm not in the cycle. What we do is we find that first cycle and we say, trade each other's houses. You're both pointing to your first choice, trade. So they trade and they leave the market. Then you say to someone who's left on the market, maybe it's me, point to your favorite house that's still on the market. And at every stage that you do this, some houses leave the market. A cycle could be someone points to his own house and say, at this point, my own house is the best, and I leave. It could be a 3-way cycle, it could be a 4-way cycle, it could be a 9-way cycle. At every stage, someone leaves the market. And the process stops when no agents and houses remain, and it has to stop in finite time. And what Shapley and Scarf and Gale observed was that the allocation that you get, you look at the houses, is in the core. There is no coalition of players that could have started with their initial houses, traded among themselves, and gotten houses that they all liked better. The proof is easy. Let's think, where could you find a coalition of traders who could do better than the allocation I've just described? Well, none of them are going to be in that first cycle that leaves the market, because those guys all got their very favorite house, their first choice. Okay? They could have indifferences, but they got at least one of their first choices in that case. So you can't make them any better off. They're as happy as they could be. How about the people in the second cycle? You might be able to make them better off, some of them, because they got the best house that was still available when you asked them. But to make them better off, you have to give them a house that initially belonged to one of the people in the first cycle. And you can't make the people in the first cycle better off, so you can't form a coalition where everyone's better off. So no one in the second cycle can be part of a coalition in which everyone is better off. So no one in the third cycle, so no one in the fourth cycle. Right? So by induction, this is in the core. You can't find another trade of houses that makes everyone better off. So the core is always non-empty, because I haven't said anything about the preferences. So notice again the difference between the theorem that you get here and the one that we get in the roommate problem. Right? This is more like the two-sided matching. We find the core is always non-empty. Okay? So there's some structure here. I will leave to you to prove that if everyone has two indivisible goods that are different from each other, a horse and a cow, and you have preference over horses and preference over cows and preference over bundles, then the core can be empty. Right? So there's something special about this model, but it has the property that the fact that the allocation is in the core means the core is always non-empty. Now, we spent a lot of time discussing the structure of the core in the stable matching problem, the structure of the set of stable matchings. Here, when preferences are strict, it's very simple. There's a unique point in the core. So when you run that algorithm, the cycles may differ in their order. You know, depending where you start, different cycles may be the first cycle and the second cycle. But you always get the same allocation of houses. Okay, so this is a problem that has different structural properties than the two-sided matching problem, and it's not two-sided. Anyone can trade with anyone. For our purposes, one of the things that's going to be important is you say, how would you get to the core if everyone's information about their preferences is private information? So you're going to have to somehow ask them their preferences, either in this decentralized way where you say, at this moment, point to the house that's your favorite among those that remain, or in a central clearinghouse. You could say to them, give me a list of your preferences and I'll run it for you. In either case, if you're using the top trading cycle procedure, it's a dominant strategy for every agent to state its true preferences. So like the proposing side in the two-sided problem, here for everyone, it's a dominant strategy. Remember, in the two-sided matching, there's an impossibility theorem that says you can't get a stable procedure that makes it a dominant strategy for everyone to state their true preferences. Here, you can make it a dominant strategy for everyone to state their true preferences. So we're in quite a different matching model. It's recognizably a matching model, but its structure is quite different. And of course, it's going to apply to different kinds of applications. Let me sketch the proof of this, or that's more than I'm really going to do. Let me give you the idea of the main point in the proof, why it's a dominant strategy for every agent to state its true preferences. Okay. Supposing here I am with the graph where I say point to your favorite house. And one of my, here, let's look at Mr. I. He's the guy I want to look at. We can see that this moment in the algorithm is not going to be kind to him. He's pointing to his favorite house, but he's not going to get it. Why is he not going to get it? Because these people form a cycle. They are each going to get each other's house, and they're going to leave the market. So here's a guy who is a candidate for maybe he's going to come to harm by telling us the truth. Maybe he could have done better if he hadn't pointed to his favorite house, since pointing to his favorite house is not doing him any good. Let's see if it could cause him harm. Supposing he didn't point to his favorite house. One thing he could have done is he could have gotten some house right now in this stage of the algorithm. He could have pointed to this house. This guy is pointing to him. He could point back, and then they would swap houses. He could point to this guy. Then they would be part of a three-way cycle. He could point to this guy. But those guys aren't going anywhere. Those are just the ones he can get now, but he can always get them whenever he wants, because what happens when we remove the cycles? The cycles are gone, but those guys remain. They must remain because they're pointing to him, and he remains. So they can't leave the market until he leaves the market. So now we're at a new step in the algorithm where we say, some guys just left, point to the house you like best among those that remain. And maybe now he wants one of these, he can still have them. But maybe this guy will point to him now, or maybe this guy will point here, and they could form a long cycle. He could get this one. Or, maybe this guy will point here, or here, or here, and he can get them. So his opportunity set is never going to shrink. The chains, right? This is a picture of cycles and chains. The chains are never going to leave until the head of the chain leaves. Right? Because they can never be part of a cycle until they're part of a cycle with him, or until he leaves and they can point somewhere else. So that's why he never comes to harm by pointing to his first choice house when we ask him to, or by giving us his list of preferences so that we can point for him. Okay, so it's a dominant strategy for every agent to state his true preferences. We ought to be able to get the preferences when the time comes. Okay, now this problem underwent further development, and a particularly germane paper is one by Atil Abdulkadiroglu, who's sitting here in the back, and Tayfun Sönmez in 1999. They looked at the housing problem, and they said, supposing instead of everyone having a house, they had a dormitory room, right? You're a sophomore in college, and you already had a room as a freshman, but you could get a better room because sophomores are treated nicer. He said, so we've got a class of rooms that some people have a room already and might want to trade it, like the housing model. Some rooms are vacant. They have no tenant because they were occupied by seniors who now graduated. And some people have no rooms. They're incoming freshmen. And it turns out that you can expand the top trading cycle model to that and get similar theoretical results that'll come in handy at an early stage when we're designing kidney exchange, because there are both living donor kidneys, kidneys that have an owner, and deceased donor kidneys, kidneys that don't have an owner, like rooms that are vacant. And there are people who have associated living donors, and there are people who don't. People who have rooms and people who don't. So that's something to think about a little bit. But let me now, in order that we can think about that, take a step back and tell you a little about transplantation. Yes?
Yeah, one question. If you switch keep the preferences as they are, but switch the initial allocation of the houses.
Yes. Then you get a different matching.
You get a different matching.
Absolutely.
Right? So you cannot use this algorithm for a case where you want, let's say, students to get jobs where the jobs have no preferences.
Right. Here, there's an initial endowment, right? So the initial endowment is absolutely important, because remember, in the roommate problem, which looks similar but does not have initial endowment, there there's no core. I mean, the whole structure is important. Absolutely. So these guys have an initial endowment that's quite important. Although in the Abdülkadiroglu and Sönmez paper, some have an initial endowment and some don't. And there's ways to think about that. Okay, so let me tell you about transplantation. There are a number of diseases for which, at this moment in time, the best treatment is transplantation. This may change. I think 100 years from now, your grandchildren, and they'll think back and they'll say what a primitive stage of medicine it was in the early part of the 21st century, because the way they helped people is they would cut an organ out of a dead person and sew it into the sick person, and what kind of way is that to do medicine? But if you're around to tell them, you can tell them we were very proud of it. It was modern medicine now, and there are many people who have no other way to save their life, and there are not enough organs. So in Israel, here's the story of candidates and transplants from deceased and living donors. Living is just important for kidneys. But what you see basically is there are lots more candidates than there are organs. And kidneys, right, the scales are very different. This top number here is 1,200. This is kidneys. The top number here for hearts is 100. It's 120 for lungs and 200 for liver. So there are a lot more people waiting for kidneys than waiting for other critical organs. The reason is not that kidney disease has a higher incidence, but that we have kidney dialysis. You can stay alive on an artificial external kidney for 5 years. Some people stay alive for a very long time. Average time is 5 years in the United States. But that means that the people who are the waiting list is much longer for kidneys everywhere in the world than it is for hearts. If you don't get a heart when you need one, you die. You can wait some time for a kidney before you die. And there are not enough organs. So it would be good to make more organs available. That's one way to increase the welfare in this system. And I'm going to tell you about making more kidneys available. So in the United States, we have, it says almost, but that's dated, we have now more. Just in the last month, we went over 100,000 people waiting for kidneys. It's expensive to wait. You can wait for years. You can die while waiting. Thousands of people die while waiting. So it would be good to have more kidneys. And kidneys are unusual in another respect. One respect is dialysis. You can wait a while for a kidney. The other is healthy people have 2 kidneys and can remain healthy with 1. So we only do 11,000 transplants a year. Do I have that number somewhere? I don't know that I have it. We do about 11,000 transplants a year from dead people's kidneys, but we do almost 6,000 transplants a year from living people's kidneys in the United States. Notice that means that our modal donor in the United States is a living donor. We do more transplants from dead people, but dead people donate both their kidneys. Okay, so our modal donor is living. And if you're healthy enough, you can give a kidney and remain healthy and save the life of someone you love. But sometimes you're healthy enough to give a kidney, but you can't give it to the person you love. Okay, because kidneys have to be compatible. And this is what opens up the possibility of exchange. Okay, so here are a simple incompatibility. Here's pair 1, the donor and the potential recipient. Donor 1 loves recipient 1, but they have incompatible blood types. Can't give a kidney. Here's a pair with the reverse incompatible blood types. An exchange would improve welfare, right? The blood type B kidney would go to the blood type B patient. The blood type A kidney would go to the blood type A patient. Okay? This kind of incompatibility, incidentally, changes over time. Our understanding of the barriers changes and things like that. So the technology changes. But let me use this simple example. Okay? So here's an exchange. And so naturally, this is a subject for economists to talk about. Economists, we study exchange. Every now and then people express surprise. They say, what are you doing talking to kidney surgeons? And the answer is we're talking about exchange. That's what we know about. Okay, we didn't invent kidney exchange. The first kidney exchange was conducted in Korea. First kidney exchange in the US was carried out in the Rhode Island Hospital in 2000. So in New England, near where I was living. Very few kidney exchanges were carried out. In 2004, before we started the things I'm going to tell you about, there are 14 transplant centers in New England. We're region 1 of the United States transplant system. Only 5 kidney exchanges had been carried out. So this is a thought that had been thought by surgeons, but it turns out it's hard to arrange kidney exchanges. And one of the reasons is these are barter exchanges. And here's Jevons talking about barter in 1876. And what he says is, he says, barter is tough to arrange. It's a hard way to organize a market because you have to find two people who want to trade with each other, and that involves a double coincidence of wants. So in fact, he talks about houses here. So think of the Shapley-Scarf housing model. The reason that's a tough model, he says, is you need to find this double coincidence. You need to find a house you want owned by a guy who wants your house. Now, in fact, it's not quite as hard as he imagines because, as Shapley and Scarf showed us, you don't need trades of just size 2. You could find bigger trades. So the guy whose house you want doesn't have to want your house. He could want a house of someone who wants a house of someone who wants your house. That eases it a bit. But what Jevons says is, listen, we need a market design solution before we can have real markets. And the market design solution he proposes is money. He says, think how money is a market design solution that removes the difficulties of barter. Instead of having to find a house you can trade for your house, you use money. You buy a house with money, you sell your house for money. It's a store of value. It removes the need to find a double coincidence. He says, of course we don't do barter. We buy and sell houses for money. So just incidentally, so the Shapley-Scarf model is not meant to be an applied economics paper. They knew that we buy and sell houses for money. They were doing an exercise that said, what can we learn about exchange by supposing that you couldn't use money and you had indivisible goods, so you couldn't trade off quantities? Okay, and they learned something about that. And as is often the case with theory, it's going to turn out to be a useful thing to know when we find the right environment. And the right environment, I'm going to propose to you to at least start thinking about this, is going to be kidneys. And why is that? Well, you can't use money for kidneys except in the Islamic Republic of Iran. They have a legal market for kidneys in Iran. But everywhere else, it's illegal to buy or sell kidneys. So here in Israel, there's an organ transplant law of 2008 that says a person should not receive any compensation in exchange for an organ, and a person should not give any compensation in exchange for an organ. So in Israel and in Europe and in virtually every place, it's illegal to give compensation. The way we write the law in the United States is, here's the 2008 National Organ, 1984 National Organ Transplant Act. The Israeli law is 2008. And it says it shall be unlawful for any person to acquire, a human organ for valuable consideration. Now, those of you who, read some contract law might think, gee, this doesn't just say you can't use money. This says you can't get valuable consideration in return for a kidney. So you might look at that exchange and say, that looks like it violates the law, right? You're giving a kidney and getting a kidney. That looks like valuable consideration. And we started doing kidney exchange on a large scale in 2004. And one of the heroes of this story, who I'll tell you about, is a kidney surgeon named Mike Reese. And he said, one of my patients is the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Ohio. I could have him prosecute me, and the courts would decide that it was legal. And everyone who, loves Mike said to him, don't do that. You can never tell what the courts will do. So eventually we got an amendment to the law, and it says that sentence does not apply with respect to human organ paired donation. So paired donation is a polite word for kidney exchange that doesn't use the word exchange. Even that bothered people who didn't think you should give valuable consideration for kidneys. But it says kidney exchange is legal in the United States. The rest, it says the preceding sentence, so it's this sentence, doesn't apply to kidney exchange. Okay, so incidentally, I learned a lot about how we pass legislation in the United States. No one opposed this. When it eventually passed, it passed by acclaim with only yes votes. No votes, no abstentions, I think. But it took 3 years. Congress is busy. The first year, they just didn't get to it. The second year, they just didn't get to it. The third year, the House sponsor of the bill, Charlie Norwood, who was a representative from Georgia, died of a transplant-related immune suppressive disease. His colleagues named the bill after him and passed it. So passing legislation is tough. There are a lot of frictions in a lot of these markets. Okay, so I'm going to tell you quickly about a series of papers. And the reason I'm going to show you them now is to both give you a quick overview of where I'm going, and also tell you a little bit about the style of work that this is, because there's two kinds of papers. There's papers in economics journals, and there's papers in medical literature. And to actually get the market going, you have to play in both businesses, and you play in different ways. So I'm going to first tell you about top trading cycles and how we initially conceived of kidney exchange. But that was before we started talking to the kidney surgeons. And it turns out that never that never quite made it. That had lots of good ideas, but that is not what got implemented. So I'll tell you the story quickly of top trading cycles. The problem, I can tell you right now, the problem is those cycles can be large. Large cycles, large trades are logistically difficult to carry out, as I will explain at some length. So when we finally started talking to docs, they said, get real, if you want to help us do kidney exchange, you better just tell us how to organize exchanges between no more than 2 pairs, the kind of exchange that I showed you, because that's what we can do. And if you want to be helpful, help us do that. So we did. And then over time, we talked to them about the benefits, and they learned about the benefits of larger exchanges, and we got some larger exchanges, and my story today is how we got to some pretty large exchanges. My last kidney exchange slide will be a very big exchange. Now, over the time that we were doing this, kidney exchange became successful in the United States. It became a standard form of transplantation. And that changed the players, because when we started, we were dealing with individual surgeons and their patients. And today, we're dealing with transplant centers that see lots of patients. And that changes the strategy sets. So if you remember, if you were here on Monday, I showed some pictures of bridges. I said, bridges get different over time, partly because the technology changes, but also because behavior changes. When you build bridges, people start to use them, and you have more traffic. Both of those things are going to happen in the story that I'm telling you. Technology has changed, and that changes the strategy sets of the players. So I'm going to start off, and I'm going to say certain things are strategy proof, and then the technology change, and some new strategies will come in, and some old strategies will go out, and what strategy proof will change as the technology changes. So I want to talk to you a little bit about that too. Now, at the same time, and Itai will who's here somewhere, there he is, will speak after coffee today, and he'll bring you up to date on, he actually knows about kidney exchange. Now, at the same time, in the medical literature, we were not proving theorems. We were sometimes running simulations, and mostly what we were doing was reporting surgeries. So I'll tell you a little bit about, as we get to how we get away from 2-way exchanges and start to do 2- and 3-way exchanges, and then how we start to do larger exchanges as well. Okay, so when kidney exchange was new, when no one was doing kidney exchange except for the occasional kidney exchange, the players in the game that we're going to design a market for were the patients and the donors and their surgeons. Okay, so patients and surgeons, when I talk to you about strategic behavior, sometimes it'll be on the part of patients and sometimes it'll be on the part of surgeons. Right? They're sort of hard to distinguish from each other. Patients take a lot of advice from their surgeons. And the strategic issue is we need to make it safe for them to reveal important medical information so we can tell who can match to whom and what the possible matches are. And back in those days, the most important kind of compatibility information on who could take whose kidney were blood types. And the initial pools that we were seeing were sort of random draws from the patient pool. Okay, these things are all going to change over time. And one of the things you can say is if the market grew large that way, then we would never need very big exchanges. That's something I'm going to tell you about. But because it has grown large in a different way, because things that were strategy proof, because some strategies weren't available to these players, are no longer strategy proof, we're now seeing a lot of strategic behavior by hospitals in ways that changes the patient pool. So that's the game theory story I want to tell you about. Okay, so the first paper we wrote before we started talking to doctors was going to be about top trading cycles, but it was going to be top trading cycles and chains. And so what we were going to do is we were going to have a patient-donor pool. Incidentally, the first thing to make a marketplace is you have to make it thick. One reason there were so few exchanges before we helped found the New England Program for Kidney Exchange is that patients and donors, incompatible patient-donor pairs, couldn't find each other. Partly that's because of medical privacy. It took us a year to get permission to look at the blood tests of patients and donors to see whether my donor might be compatible with your patient. Okay, because when you give permission in the United States to have a blood test, it's for a particular purpose, and the particular purpose was to see if you could give your kidney to the person you loved. We had to get another permission before we could look at those blood tests more widely. So the first part before, when I actually tell you about how we form exchanges, the first part, which took a year, was getting a database, getting the permissions to look at the blood tests of patients who were already in the system. Now, what we proposed is once you had a thick market, we knew it was going to take work, we'll do top trading cycles. So patients, the nodes, instead of being a patient with a person with a house, think of the Shapley and Scarf model, or a student in a dormitory room, it's going to be an incompatible patient-donor pair. So the agents are going to be a patient and an incompatible donor. And when we do top trading cycles, we'll say point to the kidney that you like best among those that you see in the database. And we're going to find cycles that way. And when we find cycles, there's no ambiguity about what the cycle is. Cycles don't intersect with each other. But sometimes we'll run out of cycles. The algorithm we're going to propose will say find cycles until you can't find any more. And then sometimes you can have chains. You can say sometimes someone's need becomes urgent and they're willing to take a deceased donor kidney. And one of the things that we learned to do in New England is we could say, fine, your donor will give a kidney to someone waiting for a deceased donor, and you will move to the head of the line and take the next deceased donor kidney that is compatible with you. And that way you could have a chain where someone takes the kidney of someone on the waiting list and someone takes their kidney and so forth. And yes, where? Yes?
Are the kidneys from deceased people and live people of equal quality?
No. Deceased donor kidneys have a shorter half-life, a shorter time in which half of them no longer work. So living donor kidneys are better. But it's going to turn out that kidneys are very personal, and if your need is urgent, then a kidney is better than not a kidney. So there will be times in which a kidney now, a deceased person's kidney now, is better for you than a living person's kidney later. While you are on dialysis, your health is deteriorating. You're getting uremia. Dialysis is not perfect. So it's also so there are timing issues as well. But if you have a choice, other things being equal, you always prefer a living kidney.
Are you indifferent among all living kidneys of the same blood type?
Good question. So no, you are not. I'm going to show you we didn't learn that though until later. Our doctor colleagues, when I show you the next model, the one on which we started the New England program of kidney exchange, we thought that you were, that it's 0-1. You're either compatible or not. That turns out not to be true, and we quickly learned that as we worked with them. So part of the story is the language of models is a language that we speak. It's not the ones our surgical colleagues speak naturally. So in answer to Ken's question, that I'm going to show you a model that we proposed that actually foreshadowed a lot of what's happened, but was not implemented. And our surgical colleagues said a couple of things to us. And one of the things they said is you don't have strict preferences over kidneys. It's either a yes or a no. Now, so we started running kidney exchanges, and they told us the rules by which they generated the yeses and the nos, and we would generate the yes and the nos, and we would propose exchanges. And we do this all with anonymized data. And then we would go to the New England Organ Bank, and they would open up the patient dossiers, and they'd say, okay, here's a yes. And then they'd look at it and say, can a woman of that size really give to a man of that size? And they'd think about it, and they'd say, yeah, yes, it's a 1. So us looking at them, we quickly understood that it wasn't really a 1 or a 0, even though that's how they conceived of it. So in subsequent models, that's going to be incorporated. Okay, so a chain is an ordered list of kidneys where someone gets a dead person's kidney and then other people get living person's kidneys.
It's not clear to me how did you implement it if you thought it is 1 zeros
Yes.
at the time.
No, at this point we didn't. At this point, in our first model, we say strict preference. Yes, in the first model we have strict preference, and the strict preference, there was a literature in dead people's kidneys. Everyone agreed that you care a lot, I'm going to tell you more about this, about how well your kidney matches to the other kidney. So for dead people's kidneys, there was a good reason to think that you had something like strict preferences. Now, at the time, in 2004, the data on living kidneys was not yet clear, so it was a defensible position that said you can either take it or not. As 10 more years of data with a lot more kidney surgeries have developed, we once again think that you probably have strict preferences over kidneys. Yes.
Does not apply to the living donors?
This is going to be living and deceased. Right now we're proposing what turns out to be politically very difficult in the United States, integrating the deceased donors and the living donors. This is not something we have succeeded in doing yet. This is a paper before we started talking to the doctors.
So the donor has to point to the compatible kidney?
I couldn't hear, I'm sorry.
So the donor has to point to a compatible.
The donor points to a kidney, and could be a dead person's kidney.
Yeah, it must be compatible.
Yes, right. So there's going to be a compatibility graph which will tell us whose kidney you can point to. Your favorite kidney will always be compatible with you. When I say, in the top trading cycle, when I say point to a house that you like best, it will always be a house you can live in.
So just like if a wife wants to donate to his husband, but they are not compatible with his wife.
So these people are all wives and husbands who cannot donate to each other. Every box has both a patient and a donor who is not compatible. And now they are offering to give their kidney to someone and to get a kidney from someone. They have to trade. Right? So the agents are incompatible patient-donor pairs. Right? So I started off and I said the agents are people who own a house. Now the agents are people who own a kidney. Now that's the wrong phrase because you don't own a kidney, but it's people who have someone who loves them and wants to give them a kidney but can't give them a kidney. And we come in together as an agent in this market and we say, we have a kidney to trade. We need a kidney and we have a kidney. What do you say? Okay? And what you can easily show is that the graph, when you say point to the kidneys you like, either has a cycle or everyone is part of a chain. When you run out of cycles, everyone's part of a chain. But chains intersect, right? There's a chain that just has one link in it. There's a chain that has two links in it. There could be another chain coming in here, so there could be long chains that come through this guy in different directions. So you need to choose chains, whereas you don't need to choose cycles. Cycles choose themselves. When there's a cycle, it's unique. But chains are not unique. So if you're going to use an algorithm that says choose chains, one of the things you need to do is think hard about chains. And I'm going to this isn't the model that ended up being adopted and implemented, but thinking hard about chains is something that we had to do in the subsequent decade. So there's either a cycle or a chain. So you can have an algorithm that says find all the cycles, top trading cycles, until there are no more, then find chains and choose one. Then when you remove those guys from the market, there may be new cycles and keep going until you can't do any more trades. Now, why are big cycles hard for our doctor colleagues to think about and do? So the reason is you can't give valuable consideration for a kidney. So the law, this was before that law was passed, but the law now says you can do kidney exchange, but you can't write a contract on a kidney. Consideration is contract language. So when the law says you can't give valuable consideration for a kidney, it means we can't write a contract that has a kidney in it. So we can't say, you give me a kidney today and I will give you a kidney tomorrow. That is not a legal contract in the United States. So we do the surgeries for those simple exchanges simultaneously. So this is a picture of a surgery that I watched. It happened to be in Cincinnati, Ohio. So I'm the man in the yellow gown keeping my hands out of the way. And there's a kidney here. And it's going into this guy here. And behind me in this picture, not in the next picture, but off screen, just steps away is another operating room. And the nephrectomy has just been performed. The kidney has been taken out. This particular one was a hand-assisted laparoscopic nephrectomy. So it's like a magic trick. The kidney appears in the hand of the assisting surgeon. It's quite something. But this is happening in Cincinnati, Ohio. At the same time, the same thing is going on in Toledo, Ohio, where her patient and his donor are doing the same thing. So the donors traveled from Toledo to Cincinnati and from Cincinnati to Toledo. The surgeons anesthetized the patients. They made the initial incisions. Then they got on their cell phones from the operating room and they said, we're ready in Cincinnati. Are you ready in Toledo? And when they confirmed that they were, the operations went ahead. So you can't write a contract on a kidney, so they did them all at the same time. 4 operations at the same time. That means for this simplest exchange between 2 pairs, you needed 4 operating rooms and 4 surgical teams. So it's logistically demanding. There's congestion in this market. It's hard to do the transactions you want to do in the time available. And of course, if you wanted to do a 3-way exchange, it would take 6 operating rooms. Okay, so this is why they said to us, that's all very nice. professor. When they call you professor, you know you're in trouble. That's all very nice, professor, but we can't do three-way exchanges. It would take 6 operating rooms. Help us do two-way exchanges. Okay, so suppose for the time being, and for the time being it was true, this is in 2004, that only two-way exchanges were feasible. That was all you could muster. Incidentally, I said it took a year in New England before we could get a database. It also took a year before we could get all 14 hospitals so that they could do their kidney surgeries on the same day, right? Living donor transplantation is elective surgery, unlike deceased donor transplantation. So there's a day of the week when the kidney surgeons get the operating rooms. The operating rooms are valuable real estate. They are always occupied by other guys on other days. So when we started proposing this, the hospital said, great idea, let's exchange, bigger pool, thicker market. We do our exchanges on Tuesday. Why don't we all do it on Tuesday? And the hospitals that did their, the kidney surgeons had the operating room on Monday said, well, actually Monday would be a more convenient day. Why don't we all do it on Monday? So it took a year to arrange that too, because the cardiothoracic surgeons are using the room on Monday. I mean, you have to move lots of things. So when you talk about frictions in markets and why they don't just spring up like weeds, why some markets are hothouse orchids that have to be nurtured, there are all these frictions. You had to get the operating rooms available at the same time so you could do kidney exchange. So here's the answer to Ken's question. For a little while in 2004, we thought the preferences, they said to us, the preferences are just 0-1. You can take a kidney or you can't, and we're only going to do two-way exchanges. So when you can only do two-way exchanges, you're not going to get as many transplants as you could otherwise get. I'll show you today. We're not just doing two-way exchanges. But still, if that's all you can do, that's all you can do. And we're market designers. We try to make things work better. So it turns out there was a lot of existing elegant graph theory in the mathematics literature that lets you do the market design for two-way in a pretty simple way. So let me tell you, we've talked about lattices. Paul talked about lattices. I'm going to tell you a little bit about matroids, which are another algebraic concept that turns out to be pretty useful. So incidentally, my model is now going to be undirected graphs. So I'm switching models. I'm going to do it one more time. I'm going to have a bunch of graph models. I had one where people pointed to the kidneys they wanted. Now I've got one. The nodes, again, the nodes remain patient-donor pairs. And I connect two of them if they have compatible kidneys in both directions. So this will be an undirected graph. Two patient-donor pairs are connected only if the kidneys can travel along the arc in both directions. Right? That's the only kind of transplants we're now considering, that just between two pairs. Okay, so what I've got is a graph, which is a set of vertices and edges. And the vertices are the incompatible patient-donor pairs with mutually compatible pairs connected by undirected edges. Right? If there's a connection between my node and your node, it means you can take the kidney of my donor and I can take the kidney of your donor. And a matching is going to be a collection of edges so that no vertex is covered more than once. No one gives a kidney twice or gets a kidney twice. So we're going to try to see who we can match to each other by picking the edges. Now, it turns out the set of nodes that you can match has a mathematical property that's a lot like linearly independence of vectors in a vector space. So we're going to let script S be the collection of subsets of nodes, of vertices, that can be matched. And it turns out that if we call the sets that can be matched the independent sets, then we have something called a matroid. It consists of a set and its independent subsets. So the analogy I want you to think of is we've got vectors in 3 space, and I'm going to talk about the subset of vectors that are linearly independent from each other. And we know a lot of things about those vectors. One of them is if you have a set of linearly independent vectors, if you have a set of people who can be matched, and then any subset is also linearly independent. So if I have 3 linearly independent vectors, then no 2 of them lie in the same plane. Another thing that's true of linearly independent vectors, and it's also true of the nodes you can match, is that if I have 2 sets of different size that are independent, I can always find one element of the larger set that I can add to the smaller set to get a new set that's linearly independent. So if I have 2 vectors that that aren't in the same plane, I can always find a third vector in 3 space that isn't in the same plane from your collection of 3 linearly independent vectors. Okay? So that structure of linearly independent vectors, being the independent sets, generalizes to many, many kinds of sets. It's an algebraic structure. And one of them is the set of nodes that you can match. So we're looking at the graph and we're saying, let's see who we could possibly get a kidney for. And we'll call the sets of people we could get kidneys linearly independent. And so that means that the maximal sets are all going to be the same size. In 3 space, when I can't find more linearly independent vectors, I have 3. That's why it's called 3 space. But I can start with any 2 vectors and find a third vector to add to that. And I can do that, therefore, in a greedy way. If I liked some vectors better than others, I could choose the vector I like best, and then I could look at the vector I like second best and see whether it's in the same line, and if it's not, I could choose it. Yeah.
For the last property, why is it a point versus a pair of points?
The last property. If S and S prime are in S, and S prime is bigger than S, then there's a point in S prime that can be added. The point is the vertex.
It's not a pair because you connect pairs.
No, this is the set of independent sets are not the matchings, they are the points that can be covered by matchings. Okay? Incidentally, I've been misspeaking when I speak about linearly independent vectors, right? You want to find a vector that's not in the same line as your first one, and then that's not in the same plane as your first 2, right? And you can always do that. So the story there is I'm eventually going to build a basis of 3 space, 1 vector at a time. And here I'm going to build a maximal set of independent vectors without yet knowing what the matching is. Okay, so this immediately gives us some theorems on these matchings. All maximal matchings have the same number of couples. So for a start, we're not going to have to say to ourselves, should we think hard about how many people we can get kidneys for in this data set? We should, of course, think hard about that. There'll be multiple ways to do it. But when we've built a set of kidneys that, of transplants that we can do that's as big as possible, it'll be, when it can't be made any bigger, it will also be cardinally as big as possible. All the sets that can't be made any bigger will have the same number of transplants in them. If patients have priorities then, which is how we do things in the deceased donor list. In the deceased donor list, for any given kidney, you generate who's compatible with it. There's a guy who's first on the list, second, third. Well, so if we have priorities, we can start off and say, here's our highest priority patient. He's a child. Can we get him a kidney? Is there some match that would get him a kidney? And we say yes. Then we say, fine, let's put him in the set. Now let's look at our second priority patient. Can we get him a kidney without, maybe by rearranging what kidney the first guy gets, but still with the first guy getting a kidney? And if the answer is yes, we put him in the set. And if the answer is no, then we skip over him. But having put our first priority guy in the set means we might have to skip somebody of lower priority, but we'll never have to skip 2 people of lower priority, right? Because the maximal sizes will always be the same. So we can use greedy algorithms. Now, when we use greedy algorithms, it makes it a dominant strategy for players to reveal to us the graph, the connections that they have, the information we need to make their connections. Let's think why we have to make that a dominant strategy. Well, first we have to hear from them about their blood types and their antibodies. I'll tell you about that. So that we can identify all feasible kidneys that they can accept. It's obviously good if we know that, but you could imagine some system of allocating kidneys where you would want to not reveal that you could take some kidney, because then you wouldn't get a kidney. We'd say, here's a guy who can take a lot of kidneys, let's save him for later and give away all the kidneys that we have now to people who have fewer links. Right? If we were going to do that, then everyone would have few links. Right? So in these days, so something that's changed technologically, in these days, patients and their surgeons reported the results of their blood tests to us. Nowadays, in some of the exchanges, they send blood, and the exchange does the blood tests. So what is a strategic variable and what isn't can change over time with the technology. But in the early days, we needed you to report the results of your blood tests, your surgeon to report the results of your blood tests.
Isn't this a little different from the usual? Well, these preferences are objective, or at least they're observed
by someone.
Yeah, but not by the.
Not by us.
Yeah. You presumably expect the surgeon to report honestly.
Oh, no. I will tell you about that. No. That would be, you're an economist. Yeah. No. And Itai may talk about that. He's got software that helps you decide which preferences to report. But no. This is a very high-stakes game. Okay? But let's think about something that the patients have to report. Supposing you have kidney disease. Your nephrologist says to you, you are going to need a transplant. So you go home for some family gathering, Thanksgiving or Pesach, and, when the family's together, you say, I got some bad news. But, your family loves you. So your brother and your sister and your mother and your father say, not a problem, let's all get tested. Now, in that graph, it's going to actually be good. I've been talking about patient-donor pairs, but of course it's actually good for you if you have more donors, because then you can have more connections. Maybe somebody can take your sister's kidney and give you a kidney, and someone else could take your brother's kidney and give you a kidney. Only one of your mishpacha will take a kidney from you, but will give a kidney. But if you have more of them, you have more connections. Okay? So, but nobody knows that except you. If we had a system that said guys with only one donor get priority because they're less lucky than guys with 3 donors, then everyone would show up with only one donor. Right? So we need you to tell us who your potential donors are. And if we were going to penalize you for having a lot, then you would never have a lot. So we're gathering information that by its nature is decentralized. Of course, it has to be a dominant strategy. But here it is. It's a dominant strategy to reveal all your donors because that gives you more links, which is good for you. Yeah?
There's also another consideration here. Perhaps the family prefers that my grandfather, who is 90 years old, will donate.
Yes.
He's not likely to survive the next 10 years.
Yeah. So absolutely. So of course, these kind of considerations, if your mother says first I get tested and your brothers get tested only later, that's what you do. But at least when you know who the available donors are, it doesn't help you. It only hurts you to not have all your donors with you together. So you could still decide that for family reasons, but you won't decide it for just trying to get a kidney. For getting a kidney, it hurts you not to show all your donors. It's safe. It's a dominant strategy for you to reveal all your donors because you'll be in more matchings and we're going to get a maximal matching. Okay? So there are efficient and incentive compatible mechanisms that solve this problem. Yes?
So there may be some preference. It says I have over the set of possible donors among my relatives.
Yes, you could have some, absolutely. Your mother could say, first we try me and we only try your siblings later. That's not an uncommon thing. Absolutely. Here in this, I don't have that. Absolutely. There are other things I don't have that I will tell you about in the course of things. But incidentally, these are good questions. When we say something is strategy proof, market design, we are looking at big worlds, and then we are modeling them in tractable models. One way we make the tractable model tractable is we restrict the strategy set. One way the world comes back and bites us is people think of new strategies, and you have to enlarge the game. So when I say something is incentive compatible here, what I mean is revealing the information that gives your links on the graph gets you more likely to match than not. Okay? But are there other considerations? Absolutely.
What are dynamic aspects of the model? So how often do they run the program?
So that's a good question. Maybe Itai will speak about research on that. Is that something you're going to talk about? Maybe. There's, that's a great question. Right now the model is static, and what we did in the early days was we didn't have many patients. We would wait a month, until you had some more patients. Nowadays we are running them very fast. But Itai understands that in a way that, so we did a little division of labor. I'm not going to show you any of the data in my talk, and Itai will show you some of the data. Okay. So let me tell you a little bit about how transplantation looks. So let me tell you a little more graph theory, and then we'll fill it in with some kidney knowledge. Boy, I'm running behind. So here's the abstract graph. It has components. Without knowing anything about kidneys, one thing you can say is there's going to be a set of under-demanded nodes. Those are the nodes that are in some maximal matchings, but not in all. There's going to be a set of over-demanded nodes. Those are the neighbors of the under-demanded nodes. And then there's going to be a set of perfectly matched nodes. These are the guys who are in every maximal matching, but aren't neighbors to the under-demanded ones. So the over-demanded nodes, how you allocate them, determines which of the under-demanded nodes are matched. Now, this is true of every bipartite graph. I haven't told you anything about blood types. We know a whole lot about these people, so now what I want to fill in is who's over-demanded and who's under-demanded. And this has to do both with your physiological characteristics and the physiological characteristics of your donor, right? Because you're a patient-donor pair. You might be several donors. Okay, so I'm going to ask this now for larger exchanges than just two ways. So the Galli-Edmonds decomposition isn't quite right, but the idea of over-demanded and under-demanded pairs is going to work. But let me just do an aside and say that by 2006, we'd made the case for at least three-way exchanges, and we did it in two papers. The first of those papers appears in the AER. It came out in 2007. Subsequently, our colleagues did some surgeries, and we reported them. That paper came out in 2006. So surgery journals are very different than economics journals. The follow-up paper, which required performing surgeries, came out a year before the original paper that proposed them. And so that's because you guys are in a profession, if you're economists, in which we publish very slowly. But in medicine, they think it's important. So they publish quickly. All right, let me tell you who can take whose kidney. There are two blood proteins that are important. Call them A and B. We call them A and B. Your blood type is whether you have, if you have just the protein A, you're blood type A. If you have just B, you're AB. If you have both, you're AB, blood type AB. And if you have none of these proteins, then in English we call you blood type O, which is not very descriptive. In many languages it's called blood type 0. It means you don't have any of the proteins. And the rule is you can't take a kidney that has a blood protein that you don't have. Okay? So O patients can give to everyone can give to their own blood type, but O's can give to A's and to AB's or to B's, but A's can only give to themselves or AB's, B's can give to B's and AB's. You can't take a kidney from a protein that you don't have. So O donors are great, they can give to anyone. O patients are very vulnerable. They can only take O kidneys. Okay? Now, for various reasons, none of them very good, we almost only deal with incompatible patient-donor pairs. That turns out to be not a good idea for various reasons. Compatible pairs could also benefit, but partly having to do with how we do the payments in the United States and things like that. There are other logistic problems for dealing with compatible pairs. So we're only going to use incompatible pairs, which means we're going to see very few O donors, because O donors are always blood type compatible with their patients. But we are going to see some O donors because there's another way to be incompatible, and that has to do with antibodies. So the chance that I can give one of you a kidney unconditional, if I didn't know my blood type, is somewhat more than 50%. The chance that I can give my wife my kidney is only around 30%, and that's because my wife and I are parents, we have children, and in the course of childbirth, my wife's immune system may have become exposed to some of the proteins that our boys inherit from me, and exposed in a way that would have caused her immune system to develop antibodies to those proteins. And what that means, if she has those pre-formed antibodies, it means that her immune system is waiting to attack my kidney if it should appear. So she can't take my kidney even if we're blood type compatible, but maybe you could take my kidney and she could take someone else's kidney, right? So
is that just the Rh factor? Or
no, not Rh factor. This is a vector of human leukocyte antigens that Itai will tell you a lot more about afterward. Maybe. I'm making promises for Itai. He's writing his slides as I speak. You know, he's saying, okay, HLA. Okay, so blood type O in the United States is actually the most common, but we're still going to have a big scarcity of those organs because mostly those guys are compatible. Okay, that's a long, bad story, but I'm going to skip that today. Incidentally, in Asia, A and B are equally likely, and O is less likely, and so when we talk to our colleagues in Seoul, there's some chance that we can do international exchanges that would have to do with the fact that we're going to have more blood type O guys than they have. And they're going to have fewer highly sensitized patients. I'll tell you about that. Okay, so here's my last graph model. I'm reversing the order of the arrows from beginning to end. In this model, an arrow will go from one pair to another if the kidney can go along the arrow. So this arrow indicates that pair 5 can give a kidney to pair 4. And this arrow in the other direction indicates they can exchange. So these guys could do a two-way exchange. These guys could do a three-way exchange. We've also got some chains. That's what the data are now going to look like. So I've got these compatibility graphs, and I want to tell you something about what we expect in large markets. So I'll need to generate some random graphs. Now I want to say right away, this is what Paul thinks I would call a theory paper. This is not what the real world is going to look like. This is what the real world would look like if we were seeing random samples from the patient population with their donors. But what I'm going to tell you about in my remaining time is how hospitals are giving us highly selected patient pools now. So this is not what the world is going to look like, but it's what the world could have looked like if we had universal conscription. Okay, so I'm going to look at graphs that have n hospitals, and they're going to generate. We're going to generate pairs. We'll generate pairs from the population pool of the general population. If they're compatible, we'll discard them. They'll go off and, if I can take my wife's kidney, I take it. Only if I can't take it do I enter the exchange pool. And then we do something like the data, but randomly with incompatible pairs. So if I'm blood type, I look at my blood type and your blood type, and I see if we're compatible. And if we're compatible, then I generate the antibodies from the general population distribution. And if I have antibodies to your kidney, then even though we're blood type compatible, I can't take your kidney. And so there's an arrow between you and me, if and only if I can take your kidney. And it turns out there's a 1950s elaborate, nice set of theorems by Erdos and Rainey, the famous Erdos, which says as graphs get large, there's a threshold on how dense the probabilities are. If the probability that one node is connected to another in this way is above log n over n, then in the limit, everyone is connected to everyone, basically. There becomes a giant connected component. And what that means for kidneys is that only the blood type compatibilities are going to matter in the limit, because even if you have lots of antibodies, we're taking the limit as the number of donors goes to infinity, there'll be someone who has proteins that you don't have antibodies to, right? In the limit, you have identical twins out there, and you never have antibodies to your identical twin. Okay? Indeed, the first organ transplantation in the world, the first successful one, was done in 1954 in Boston by Joseph Murray, who later won a Nobel Prize for his work on transplantation. And the patient and the donor were identical twins. So in 1954, we still didn't know much about antibodies, but you don't have antibodies to your own proteins. So an identical twin transplant worked. That was the first successful organ transplant. So it was a live donor transplant. Okay, so you're going to get these giant connected components. And when you do, here are going to be your over-demanded pairs. So let's take a look at this graph. In the limit, this is a counterfactual limit, who would be in demand? Well, these are the patient-donor pairs where the patient is blood type A and the donor is blood type O. Remember, blood type O is going to be rare. They can give to anyone, and mostly we're not seeing them because they're compatible. So these guys have an immunological incompatibility. All of these guys who are over-demanded are blood type compatible. So mostly we're not seeing many of them. And all the guys who are under-demanded, that is, all the guys who are going to be left over unmatched when we found maximal matchings, they're blood type incompatible. These guys are, the patient has blood type O. He can only take an O kidney, but his donor has blood type A, can only give to people who have A or AB. Right? So when we're done, and these are the perfectly matched pairs, they just match with each other. And so loosely speaking, it's the allocation of the O kidneys that are going to determine which of the O patients gets matched. And what you see is, in the limit, we could almost get by. This is what efficient matchings would look like. We'd almost get by with pairwise exchanges. There would be some three-way exchanges that we need, but no four-way or five-way or six-way. Because in the limit, you wouldn't have to do them. You would efficiently use, this would get you a maximal matching with these pretty small exchanges. And this kind of observation, some of it made earlier than this paper, helped convince our surgical colleagues that they should at least expand the infrastructure to be able to do three-way exchanges. So so for a long time now, we've been able to do three-way exchanges. Now, just incidentally, notice the exchanges, the inefficient exchanges aren't just, one kind of inefficient exchange is you take an O kidney and you give it to, an AB patient, or you give it to a B patient, you give the O kidney to the B patient and the A kidney to the A patient. These guys could exchange. But that's inefficient because you're taking two guys who would get kidneys anyway, and you are not giving it to people who won't get kidneys anyway. Right? So you'd hate to do that kind of giving an O kidney to someone who doesn't need an O kidney. There are more complicated exchanges that are inefficient. There are 4 blood types, so you could find a 4-way exchange that looks like this. Here's an AB-O pair. This is an easy guy to match because the patient has blood type AB. He can take anybody's kidney. And the donor has blood type O. He can give to anyone. This is a really valuable guy. So what you might think, if you're a big transplant center, is let's do a fancy 4-way exchange. The O kidney will go to this O patient. The A kidney will go to this A patient. The B kidney will go to this B patient. And this AB patient will get an AB kidney. Why should we waste an AB donor who has trouble giving to anyone? We can give it to the AB patient. The trouble with that is two of these guys, the ABO and the AB, are over-demanded pairs. They're guys who are going to get kidneys anyway, and they could have gotten kidneys in three-way exchanges, 2 three-way exchanges, six transplants, instead of this one of 4 transplants. So it's not just the small hospitals who can't do big exchanges who might use kidneys inefficiently. It's also the big hospitals who can do very fancy exchanges that you wouldn't want them to do because it destroys value. Incidentally, computationally, polynomial time to find pairwise, polynomial time to find exchanges of unlimited size. But if you put limits and say a three-way, you can do 2 or 3-way exchanges but not bigger, that's an NP hard problem. Yes?
Can we go back one slide?
I can.
Are there any problems, for example, if you have a patient that has a donor with O blood type and he says, okay, I'd rather prefer to take the kidney of my sister than to...
They can do that. But of course, we could get more exchanges if they didn't have that preference.
So in the real market, are there problems?
The compatible patients mostly do not come to us, which it's exactly the problem that you say. If they came to us, we get more transplants. We could also maybe do better for them. If I needed a kidney, the people who love me enough to give me a kidney are mostly my age. They are my wife, my brother, my wife's brother. Their kidney would save my life. Maybe you need a kidney, and you have someone who loves you who's a 25-year-old Olympic athlete with a great kidney, but is incompatible. So my brother-in-law's kidney would save your life, and your Olympic athlete's kidney would be better for me than my brother-in-law's. So there would be value to exchange. But because of logistical problems that I will not get a chance to tell you about, mostly we are not seeing those. So it's not that we are doing as well as we possibly could. We are just doing as well as we can right now. Okay, so let me, so one of the things I want to tell you about now is undirected donors. Deceased donors are mostly undirected, not by law, but by practice. If you are riding your motorcycle without a helmet and you fall off it and become a donor, mostly we have to give your kidney to someone very quickly. So you cannot have specified it easily in advance who should get your kidney. But nowadays, there are also living non-directed donors. We see quite a few of these. You see them in Israel as well. These are donors who want to give a kidney and have no particular group in mind. About a third of our non-directed donors in the United States come from faith-based organizations, including a quite effective Hasidic group in New York called Renewal. Here in Israel also, some of the Haredim who don't acknowledge brain death and therefore are underrepresented in the deceased donor pool are overrepresented in the living donor pool. What we used to say to them is, you go through a lot of tests before you can be a non-directed donor, not just physiological, but also psychological. But if you pass through all those screens, what we used to say to them is, what the surgeons used to say to them is, okay, you could, what a great thing to do. You could save someone's life who's been waiting for a kidney for a long time. But once we started having a thick market, we could say, you could start a chain. You could give to someone who's waiting for an exchange, and their donor can give to someone else, and their donor can give to someone on the wait list. So here's what a picture like that looks like. And one of the things I want to talk about is why there are only 6 people in that picture. Okay? And one reason there are only 6 people in that picture is, remember, we could only do 3-way exchange at this point. That's 6 operating rooms. So these are them. They were in the 6 operating rooms. That's all we could manage. But another reason, or not another reason, what could be another reason in this counterfactual world is you don't need chains longer than that. So let's look at this graph that I showed you before after we've done a maximal exchange. All the shaded guys are gone. They all got kidneys. All that's left is the unshaded one. We get a non-directed donor, and good luck, he's blood type O, the best kind, easiest to give to a patient. So we don't waste his kidney, we give him to an O patient. The A donor gives to an A patient. Now we have an AB donor. There are no more AB patients left. They already all got kidneys. But of course, we have 100,000 people on the waiting list. 4% of Americans have blood type AB, so there's always AB patients on the waiting list, so we can get another transplant. So that's 3 transplants, 6 people in the picture. 3 donors and 3 recipients. There they are. So bad news, we can't use these non-directed donors more effectively. This turns out not to be true. The story between 2007 and now is we use them more and more effectively. So I want to tell you what's wrong with this model, how it works that we use them, and how we manage to do longer chains when we can only assemble 6 operating rooms at a time. Okay, that's my task for the next 15 minutes. Okay? Hospitals are withholding some of their patients. So the world has changed. When we started, no one was doing kidney exchange. If you wanted to do kidney exchange, you had to come to us. Now, everyone is doing kidney exchange in the United States, all the big transplant centers. So if you're the director of a transplant center, you can say, you know, before we send off our patients to the kidney exchange, let's see if we can just do any internally. That'll be simpler. We'll just do them by ourselves. Why might you want to do that? Well, right now, we could change this. Maybe Itai will tell you some stuff about that. We have a plan of a better algorithm, but right now we haven't been able to implement it. That would make it safe for hospitals to show us all their patients. But right now it's not safe for hospitals to show us all their patients, and let's see why that is. Supposing this is the compatibility graph. I've got a bunch of patient-donor pairs here and where the kidneys can go. And what you see is 3 of these patient-donor pairs I've called A, A1 and A2 and A3, and that's because they come from hospital A. So you are the director of hospital A. And you look at this and you say, I can do these exchanges in my own hospital. I better do that. Why is that? If I show them to the kidney exchange, it might be that here is the compatibility graph. What exchanges will you want to do to maximize the number of exchanges? You'll want to do this 3-way exchange and this 3-way exchange. You'll get 6 transplants. That's great, but one of hospital A's patients won't get transplanted. So hospital A looks at this and says, the hell with that. We can get 3 of our patients transplanted. Let's do it. That's bad for the system because instead of 6, we only get 3. But it's good for hospital A because they are doing 3 transplants and their patients are getting kidneys. Okay? Turns out in large markets, you could have some kind of frequent flyer system that would reward them and would make sure that hospital A was okay. Remember, there were always blood type O patients left over. So when we find maximal matches, we are always breaking ties. We're always saying the scarce O donors go to somebody's O patients. So one way we could solve this problem is by saying you're in our frequent flyer program, you get upgraded. When we have an O kidney, we could give it to one of your patients. But right now, our surgical colleagues think that's a terrible idea because they like to believe that we're only matching on medical criteria, and to say that you are from hospital A is not a medical criterion. This can happen in other ways, even when we just had 2-way exchange. Here's hospital A again. They can do a 2-way. If they show us their patients, though, we could do 4 transplants instead of 2. Why might they not want to show us their patients, even though in this graph they get transplanted anyway? Well, what they're worried about is that this will be the graph, and that patient B is a high priority patient. Patient B is a child. So that right now when we look at them, we say, look, we can, here's our highest priority patient, let's match him. We get 2 transplants, we're done. But hospital A doesn't get its 2 transplants. So the argument that's hard to make still with our doctor friends is we say to them, you have to promise hospital A something like you're going to get these transplants, even if this is the graph. And they say, but how about the child? And we say, well, the child isn't getting a transplant here anyway because we're never seeing these guys. Hospital A is withholding these patients. So we're still in conversation about design, and these are design conversations. So what happens when hospitals withhold patients? The easy-to-match patients get taken out of the pool, and we see a higher proportion of hard-to-match patients. The way we measure how hard you are to match is your PRA, your probability of reactive antibodies. Basically, we measure your antibodies and say, supposing you're blood type compatible, what's the chance that you still can't take someone's kidney? And if you're pretty healthy, that chance is 0. Blood type compatibility is all that matters. But if you've already had a transplant, if you've had lots of blood transfusions, every time you get exposed to human protein, there's a chance that you build up antibodies. And only in the general population, only 10% of the population is above 80. But in the kidney exchanges that we're now working with most closely, Itai gets data feeds every morning, we have this huge mode of people who are almost impossible to match. These guys have between 95 and 100% chance of not being able to take your kidney even if you have the right blood type for them. Okay, so we're getting this big selection. There are some easy-to-match pairs, mostly from smaller hospitals, and then from the big hospitals we're getting these guys who they can't match internally. And when you break up these guys who are hard to match, let's just look at this graph now. They're really hard to match. They're way skewed to the right. And that means when I look at the compatibility graph, here's a compatibility graph drawn from a moment in the data of one of the centers we work with. These guys, every node is a patient-donor pair, and an arrow goes from one node to another if the kidney can go. These guys all have blood type A. In this particular data set that I'm showing you, every patient and every donor has blood type A. So there's no blood type incompatibilities in this graph. But still, most of them don't have very many arrows coming in. There's just a small group of low sensitized patients, 8 patients marked in blue. They have lots of arrows coming in. And what that means is you can't find lots of short cycles, right? Because when the graph is sparse, the chance that if you have enough people, the chance that somebody can give you a kidney is not so low. But the chance that you can give them back a kidney is very low because everyone is highly sensitized. But the chance you can pass it on, you can give someone else a kidney, that's not so bad. But the chance they could give it back to the first pair, that's still pretty low. So we're going to start building chains. And when you look at this graph, if you picked up the blue things and shook them, you'd get this medusa, this jellyfish. There's the low sensitized patients on the top. They are the densely connected part of the graph. And then there are these chains. So the way you have to model those is with 2 kind of nodes, easy to match pairs and hard to match pairs. And I've suppressed, this is the dense part of the jellyfish, and there are lots and lots of arcs that I've suppressed here between these guys. They can all give each other's kidneys. But it's wasteful for them to give each other kidneys because these guys can hardly any of them give each other kidneys, but we can find chains, and it's easy to continue the chain by going back up here because these guys, they can take almost anybody's kidney. But these guys can take hardly anyone's kidney. So we start getting chains, and here we are. There are a lot of open mathematical problems here. The only thing we know how to do to study these graphs is use limit theorems of the Euler-Shreni kind. So to keep the graph sparse, we say that if you're hard to match, the probability you can match with another node goes down as the graph grows. So that's not an accurate physiological model, but here what we're doing is we're saying on average the hard to match guys are only going to have C kidneys they can take, some constant number of kidneys, even as the graph grows, because we make the probability smaller. And that lets us prove theorems that says now there's no limit to how big an exchange you'd like to do. If you could do exchanges instead of size 3, if you could do exchanges of size 4, you would get a linear increase in the number of transplants you could do. And the same thing if you have a single non-directed donor. You could have a chain that gave you a big increase. So to get a big increase, you have to do big chains. So here are these guys. How are we going to do a bigger chain? There's 6 of them. They fill up all the operating rooms we can get at once. So we have to figure out a way to get them in more operating rooms so we can have more guys in the picture. So, remember, here we are. We're sort of saying, here's a chain. We could start with a non-directed donor. It could be part of an optimal solution. Here we can get 8 things. But maybe there's a way to have long chains and not in this graph, but get more transplants. So to do that, we have to break the constraint that you can only use the operating rooms you have simultaneously. So let's do a cost-benefit analysis. This is the simplest kind of economics. Let's see why we do things simultaneously. So let me do a counterfactual. Here's a simple 2-way exchange. We always do these simultaneously, so don't come away with the wrong message. Supposing we didn't do them simultaneously. How come we always do them simultaneously? Well, supposing on day 1 we planned that donor 2 would give a kidney to recipient 1. That happened successfully, so donor 2 no longer has a kidney. And on day 2, instead of doing it simultaneously, donor 1 is scheduled to give a kidney to recipient 2. But for whatever reason, donor 1 fails to do so. This is really a bad event. This is why we never let this happen. We always do these simultaneously, because these guys have been tragically harmed. They had a surgery. They gave away a kidney but didn't get one, so they had a surgery, which is no small deal. But they no longer have a kidney for exchange. They didn't get a kidney, and they can't take part in kidney exchange. They don't have a kidney anymore. You can't write contracts on kidneys. They're stuck, right? Next week when we run another kidney exchange, they won't be part of it. So they've been tragically harmed. So we never do this. We always do these simultaneously. And that's why. But supposing we have a non-directed donor, a living non-directed donor. Now, on day 1, he gives a kidney to recipient 1. And on day 2, for whatever reason, like there, donor 1 fails to give a recipient to give to 2. The chain breaks. That's very disappointing. But it's not tragic. These guys are no worse off than they are before the non-directed donor appeared. And they still have a kidney. Next week, we'll put them in the kidney exchange. We'll get them a kidney. Okay, so the cost of a broken link is much less. Let's see what the benefit could be. We proposed this in a surgery paper, and And here's a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine with the hero of this story is Mike Reese, the guy who was on the end of the phone in Toledo, Ohio. And he went ahead and did a non-simultaneous thing. And this is an unusual, market design kind of paper. It's got surgeons in it and economists and computer scientists. I mean, it's a big collaboration. And here's the first chain. It's got 20 people in the picture. Okay? So when you don't need to assemble all the operating room simultaneously, you can do a lot more transplants. So the question is, and why do we need them? We need them because the grafts are sparse. This is how we're getting the hard-to-match patients matched. Incidentally, at the time we went to press, there were 20 people in the picture, but this lady who allowed her name to be used, Helena McKinney, she's blood type AB. It was hard to find a match for her. We almost never let them end a chain now. 2 years later, they found an appropriate match for her, right? AB patients can always take blood type compatible. There are very few of them, so the ones who are left are really highly sensitized. They can hardly take anyone's kidney. So it took a while, but 2 years later she continued this chain, and there are 32 people in the picture by the time it ended with a donation to someone on the deceased donor list. So a little bit of behavioral economics here. We have about 2% reneges. Mostly people are pretty nice. When they say they're going to give a kidney next Tuesday, they give one. And when they say they're going to give a kidney and you approached her 2 years later, she still gave one. So it's easy to make a model in which no one gets a kidney after the person they love has gotten a kidney. That is not what we're observing. And we could talk more about that, but I don't have that much time. So we're now doing, up through 2013, more than 10% of the live donor transplants in the United States are through kidney exchange. So we've become a very standard part. The majority are through chains. Most chains are short, but occasionally the very long chain, those tail ends really do it. And that's where the highly sensitized people get their kidneys, right? Because you just can't get them in short cycles. So we have more and more highly sensitized people, and we have long chains. Here's a chain with 60 people in the picture, okay? 30 nephrectomies and 30 transplants. So that's how we're doing a lot of our kidney exchange in the United States. So it involved this evolution over time of the strategy sets, of the changes in the players behavior. In my lecture on Monday, I showed you, old bridges and new bridges. This isn't Pythagoras' theorem. We're not trying to solve kidney exchange once and for all. We're trying to build kidney exchange and keep it going. Now I've got 5 minutes left. So let me mention that I could, Itai will continue and tell you everything I didn't. But what we're going to tell you about some problems that we have. But mostly we're telling you about victory after victory. We're so successful. It's in a war that we're losing. When I started doing kidney exchange, we had 40,000 people on the list. Now we've got 100,000. That's not all bad news. It means we can keep people alive longer. But it for sure means that we aren't getting enough kidneys, even though we are getting thousands of extra kidneys through kidney exchange. So we need to do other things, and one of the things we need to think about is deceased donation. Now, Israel has historically had very low deceased donation rates, partly because of the question of what it means to be deceased. The typical deceased donor patient is brain dead. They die on a ventilator, so their organs are still getting oxygen, but they are dead. They have left the room. The medical religious law says that's fine, but not everyone thinks it's fine. If you wait too long to be dead, then all your organs are dead. If your heart stops beating. So Israel, for various reasons, has had low per million contribution rates. But now there's an exciting experiment. Experiment's the wrong word. I use that. Economists do experiments. There's an exciting development in Israel about deceased donation because the new donation law gives priority to get an organ for people who are on the waiting list and for their families who have consented to allow a donation to go on. So top priority, these are tie-breaking points, but last year around a third of the people who got transplants in Israel would not have gotten them if they had not had priority. So it's tie-breaking with some muscle. Is granted to candidates whose first-degree relatives donated organs after death or have themselves been live kidney or liver lobe organs.
What does death mean?
Death means, well, death doesn't mean anything. It means the organs got transplanted. So if death to you means your next of kin have to be so dead that their organs cannot be transplanted, then you do not get priority. So it means brain death in Israel. But you can also do cardiac death if you work fast. In Barcelona, fast means 2 minutes. In the United States, it means 5 minutes. Normally, these are patients on a ventilator, but to make them halakhically dead, you turn the ventilator off, but you are ready to go. Second priority is to candidates who have registered. Third priority is if your relatives have registered. The motivation has to do with this complicated story about disagreement about what's death. Here's the donor card. It says a couple of things. It says, I want to give my organs. You can choose organs, right? Here's kidneys. And there's this funny clause that we're not sure how it's going to play out, but so far it's not being checked very much, which says, I want to give organs, which is to say, therefore, I want to be eligible for priority, as long as a man of religion, an ishdat, chosen by my family, says it's okay. So one possibility is this could be a loophole. But in the early registrations, when you look at who's signing up and what their zip codes are, it appears that the people who think that you have to be dead in a different way are just not signing up at all. So it's changed the status quo a little bit. And it provides an incentive to register. It's a market design solution. And when we look at consent rate, so this went into effect in 2011, when we look at consent rate, these data are still very, very new, so you can't draw any conclusions. Consent rates are going up in Israel, next of kin consent rates. So maybe, it's way too early to tell, but this is what we're talking about. So there are market design things you can think about for deceased donors as well as for living donors, and they involve the families, the next of kin. Okay? One question you can ask, of course, is why can't we just buy and sell kidneys? Think how simple it would be if we could just go to China and buy the organs of executed prisoners, as we used to be able to do, many of us, but cannot anymore. Israelis can no longer do that. The Kupat Holim used to pay for you, no questions asked, but no longer does. But how about living donors, right? You can. I was in Azerbaijan and had pointed out to me a hospital where you could buy a kidney. It's against law in Azerbaijan. The only legal market is in Iran. Incidentally, the medical halakha, the Jewish religious law, is nuanced on this subject. The Christian churches all think it's a terrible idea to buy and sell kidneys, but the Jewish jurisprudence and the responsa and apparently the Islamic jurisprudence are nuanced on this. And I'm going to talk about these questions generally. It turns out there are lots of things we don't buy and sell. And so I'm giving an arrow lecture on Monday, and that will be my topic. I'm going to talk about repugnant transactions, and it turns out the word for remorse in Hebrew is musar klayot, kidney morals. So it's sort of like we have the phrase gut feeling, but it turns out in the Bible they thought your conscience was in your kidneys. So on Monday I'm going to talk about this question of, wouldn't market design for kidneys be simple if we could just buy and sell them? But it's against the law everywhere in the world. And it turns out I'm not going to talk about kidneys primarily on Monday. I'm going to talk about things that, repugnant transactions, things we don't think you should buy and sell, and what we know about that and what we don't. And I know very, very little about that, but I can entertain you with. But I think it's important. I think as social scientists, we need to understand more about that. As economists, we train ourselves to think all voluntary transactions are great, unless they have big, obvious negative externalities. Not everyone thinks that way, and buying and selling kidneys is against the law everywhere in the world except Iran. So let's take a coffee break, and then everything you don't understand will be made clear to you by Itai.